Hello, everyone. I'm Ron Lemon, and this is Level Up with Lemonade, a side mission, episode 3. In this episode, we're going to look at the axial skeletal portion of the human form from George Bridgman's drawing book. We're going to look at the chest muscles, the back muscles, the abdominal muscles, the lower back muscles, and I've also included the shoulders and the hips as part of this episode. Since there isn't a whole lot of information on the torso in the book, I wanted to expand upon that from top to bottom within the torso space. I've also included 2 demonstrations, one anterior and one posterior, utilizing the information from the book. All right, well, we've got a little bit of information to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. This section covers the front of the torso from the rib cage to the abdominal wall, the serratus muscles, and the external obliques. This part of the book is where things get a little bit dicey as far as the writing to pictures are concerned. The torso, in this first section, he's describing the skeletal portions of the torso, but you wouldn't know that by the pictures at all because the pictures are fleshed over. But what he's describing here has to do with, in this case, the rib cage, and how the rib cage is rounded and the ribs themselves are protecting all of the organs. But what he doesn't describe are some of the nuances that are important to understand, like the sternum at the top ends around rib number 5. Rib 6 blends in with it, but rib 5 is where that terminates. The widest point of the rib cage is rib number 8. And the lowest portion of the rib cage is rib number 10. Those would be helpful, especially since if you do construction drawing with me, we don't draw every rib. It would be really tough to do. And I wouldn't recommend it because it's, in the beginning at least, because it really is more important that you assemble the Legos together versus getting nuanced with the details. Eventually, when you put the muscles on, you'll want to indicate where rib number 5 is and rib 8 and rib 10 because certain muscles attach to these areas. But in the beginning, it's really about blocking things in together and piecing it all together. What he is describing, though, is when the arms are raised, as an example, the rib cage between the ribs will spread out a little bit more, where when the arms are down, they'll compress more. They won't be as spread out. Then on this page, he describes the pelvis, but there really isn't anything in here visually describing the pelvis. But what he is mentioning is that the pelvis is more squarish than the rib cage is. This is where a lot of us get the idea of building the pelvis as a block from figure construction, because Bridgman and Gottfried Bams both indicate this, that there's a certain type of geometry that differs between the lower half versus the upper half. And he mentions the iliac crests spread wide in the front, which they do. And as an artist, we sort of put these little edges on to bring the fascia down and attach it for the abdominal wall. Now, importantly though, if we zoom in on this 3D model here, we can see what he's talking about with the ribs. They start narrow back here and go upward this way. Then they drop down at an angle, spread out and get a little bit wider before they get narrower again along the sternum. This little notch right here is called the xiphoid process. This part up here is called the manubrium. The manubrium is where the clavicle attaches. The clavicle is attached to the acromion process, which is a part of the scapula that's floating above the rib cage. The part that holds the whole arm together is right here at this little tiny point. That's holding your entire arm onto the skeleton. The muscles are holding the scapula against the rib cage to prevent it from sliding away. It's anchored very firmly with muscles. And then as he describes the pelvis, it may not look box-like from this, but it is very box-like in its design. It has a slight angle this way, where the rib cage has a slight angle this way. The bottom of the rib cage is more forward than the top. The top of the pelvis is more forward than the bottom. And then while we're here, I just wanted to point out also that the spine is not a straight line, as much as you might see it that way in books because of the forward-facing shot or the rear-facing shot. The spine has 3 curves to it. You have the lumbar curve, the thoracic curve, and the cervical curve. And yes, George also refers to the rib cage as the thorax. So if you read that word through here, he basically means rib cage. There are a few words that we no longer use the same way they used to be used. And as we get further down into the hip muscles and so forth, you'll find that some of the words have been changed out entirely, and we use a different naming convention for parts of the body. In this part of the book, he starts to talk about the geometry of the body. And if you don't know the other names, like the epigastrium, which is the opening right along in here of the rib cage, then you would definitely get thrown off a little bit. But what he's talking about has to do with, on this particular page especially, has to do with, in the very beginning, he talks about how there's a straight line that marks the collarbones along in here. And then there's a straight line below that terminates the pectoralis muscles just above the epigastrium. Then the epigastrium opens up and aims towards the points on the iliac crest on both sides, while the abdominal wall converges down below into the pelvis. And then he talks about, and the buttressing of the lateral muscles on both sides. That just basically means building walls on both sides, over here and over here, with the what is called hypochondriac portion of the rib cage, and then the obliques, while the abdominal wall narrows as it comes down into the pubis and is framed by the fascia that holds it in place. And on this page, he describes the motion of the figure and how the long triangle that comes all the way down through the abdominal wall breaks into 2 as the body flexes towards one of its sides. But you can still utilize the triangle system, especially in an extreme bend. The center of that abdominal opening will aim towards one of the iliac crests. And then the very bottom half of the abdominal wall is its own wedge from the lower abs down into the pubis. And then this drawing isn't even described at all, but it does indicate how the body flexes on one side and extends on the other side, although the drawing of these curves don't necessarily indicate extension. This side is extending more, while this side is flexing more, and it's broken into these 3 particular sections. The creases we get, or the folds we get in our skin, the first one that's going to emerge is at the bottom of the rib cage. The second one that's going to emerge is above the iliac crest, and the third one that emerges is at the 9th rib along the rib cage. Those are the 3 folds of the skin that you'll get when leaning over to one side. Just thought I'd add that in because anything that will help you identify the skin folds or anything else on the body makes it so much easier when you know what those folds are linked to, since the body folds are universal for all of us. Here, Bridgman talks about the plane structure, and the first plane that he's describing, I'm going to just draw straight over the pictures again. The first plane that he's describing is the one that's up along through here that separates the shoulders from the torso, and how we have a plane break along here versus along here. The second plane break that he's describing has to do with the chest muscles in the front. And the third has to do with this shape down here, which he's calling rounded. So it isn't necessarily a plane break, but more so what I think he's describing are masses. These are each of the different masses that you want to be thinking through, from through here and here, separating the side from the front. In the front, divided in 2, the chest portion, then the abdominal portion in the epigastrium, and of course the lower abs, which are a wedge that has a small plane above and then a long tapering plane going down to the pubis. And then this page is kind of all over the place because it's more than just the muscles in the torso. It's also the kneecap, it's the shoulder muscles. It's a good number of muscles, but the geometry that the muscles have within them, as opposed to just being rounded chunks of meat, these are very descriptive geometrically, which you're going to find in all of his drawings that he does. So this one is the adductors. Those are our legs. This is the triangle wedge that's next to the big teardrop shape of our legs. This is the quadricep. This triangle is the adductor group. These we don't really see. They're buried under the erector spinae group, which is a long ovoid shape on our back. basically the abdominal wall of our back. The pectoralis muscle has this overlap and fold to it, or not fold, but an overlap of the muscles. So when the arm is down, this overlaps this. But when the arm is up, all of these are parallel with each other. These two tendons have to do with the latissimus and the pectoralis muscles that help pull the arm down when it's raised up. The rhomboid muscle, which looks like a tilted diamond, the rhomboid is between our scapulas and has a shape something like this between both sides of the spine to the scapulas. The deltoid, or the shoulder muscle, is a triangle within a triangle, sort of, right? We see it as a big turning curve like this, but it's a little bit more like this. So a larger triangle with a smaller triangle on the inside. And then this goes to the front and back. This is the trapezius, although the trapezius is shaped a little bit more like this. It's still in a giant trapezoidal shape. The obliques on the side of the body are long and angular forward. That's the obliqueness of them. And then the rectus femoris, the bicep femoris, the bicep, and a lot of the arm muscles are very similar to this kind of design right here, kind of a cigar-like shape. The kneecap is on a pulley system, the pulley just being the bones. And then this is the omohyoid muscle in the throat that sort of goes through the hyoid bone. Another thing that we don't necessarily see visually, but design-wise is important to understand. On this page, he sort of assembled all of those shapes together to give you the masses of the upper torso. And I would say that this is more or less the definitive anatomy page, where the other page was anatomy, but more in a geometric sense. This is the organizational. Number 4 are the serratus muscles. There are 9 of them in total, 4 of them usually always visible. Unless you slide your arm forward out in front of you, then it'll cover up the bottom one, and then you only see 3. The pectoralis major, while this is aimed downward like so, we do want to think of that muscle in some ways like this, with this portion of it attached to the arm. But the striations are like this, with this one being the most dominant and the topmost of all the striations. The deltoid, which sits over here next to the pectoralis, comes around and attaches halfway down the humerus and is like one more striation out off to the side as these turn like this inward into the body. The abdominal wall, which in this case he has in 3 parts, although up here on a fully developed bodybuilder is going to be like this. This one is like this. This one in here is like this. And then this one takes us to the pubis. And then finally the external obliques, which do what are called interdigitation between the serratus muscles. So each serratus muscle comes forward like this, but the abdominals each come down like this, interdigitating between them, while the last few that attach to the ribs 10, 11, and 12 are anchored to the iliac crest. And then here he is really emphasizing the cage of the torso, which is this part right here, really showing how to push that visually through the torso and retaining that shape regardless of the angle you see the torso in. Now, you may or may not be able to see this on each individual, but a big problem that I do find with students that I teach, they have a tendency to get literal about the ribcage being a box, and they draw it right up into the shoulders as opposed to seeing it as an egg shape. They don't pay attention to these curves over here and over here, namely because a lot of the photographs they work from, since most of the teaching is online, they don't see the division between these two muscle groups. And because we do describe the body in terms of boxes, it becomes a more literal design tool as opposed to it just implying the plane structure and the volume that we're building the figure from. But he really does push those distortions when he's drawing his figures, George Bridgman or his students. They're really emphasizing the design structure of the particular shapes that he's described over the past few pages. And it's not a bad idea to do the same thing with your work, especially when the model is flat lit. Imply these just a little bit more, and it'll give your drawing more structure. We continue in this section by looking at this side of the torso, the pectoralis muscles, the abdominal wall, the serratus muscles, the latissimus, and the obliques. The profile of the body is what this next particular section is describing as far as its geometry goes. Now, with this drawing, it isn't, especially in the area of the pectoralis muscle, it isn't as clear. It doesn't have a clearly defined shape because the lines are sort of, there's shading lines in addition to their construction lines, so it's a little bit confusing. But what he's describing has to do with how the chest has an angle that sort of faces downward like this with an undercut. Then you have what he calls the costal cartilage, and that's all of the front of the rib cage where the rib joins together, and that's the volume along here, and that frames the abdominal wall. And then on the back side, we have the scapula that forms an almost vertical line, framed with the latissimus muscle that swings around in this particular direction, and how the rib cage has a strong shape feeling from the front along through here into the back. Then there's the obliques that come down along like this, running into the abdominal wall, that form a strong shape above the iliac crest along in here. The iliac crest is a strong shape doing this way, and also in the front this way. The abdominal wall has three sections: this section, the midsection, and the lower section, almost equal in proportion to one another. And then on the back, the strong line that we have of the erector spinae muscles and the latissimus muscle as it comes down into the tailbone. And then, of course, there's the collarbone, the frame of the collarbone up above that goes into the trapezius muscle into the back. So these are boundaries, if we can remember them, that will give our drawing so much more structure to it if we can remember, especially in a photograph that's either mostly in shadow or washed out with light. These areas don't have clear definition all the time, but if we can remember these, that'll give our drawing so much more development through the profile line. And this page is even stronger in its defining of these lines. The collarbone straight across through here. He has the scapula sort of aimed forward, although it is actually a little bit more vertical than that. Costal cartilage that frames through here. The ribs dip down before they come back up again, and the serratus muscles follow that in their sawtooth-like design. The pectoralis line, and then the abdominal wall, all of the muscles together combined make this wedge that sort of intersects the costal cartilage. The strong turns of the pelvis through here, and then the large, strong muscles in the back that hold everything together. This doesn't really have any words to it, but this is the hip. This is the rotation, the center point of the hip, and then the offset line of the great trochanter from that, showing its movement through this circular shape, framed by the oblique above up here, the rectus femoris over here, and the gluteus muscle as it locks into the back of the femur bone. This drawing over here is the gluteus muscles in the back. The great trochanter is off to the side, and the column that runs up the spine on both sides, the erector spinae group, that holds the rib cage and the pelvis together. The abdominal wall of the back of the body. But again, there aren't any words in here that describe that. Then as far as anatomy goes, the latissimus muscle comes down and attaches to the iliac crest and swings across the back of the body through here. The obliques that come down and form this mass, although the obliques run all the way along here, the strongest part of the obliques is this shape through here. And what he's also describing here has to do with how the obliques are attached to the lower 8 ribs along here, and the attachment of the latissimus, the front of the arm over here, the spine, and the posterior superior iliac spine on the pelvis. Then we have this layered system through these other 4 pages. The very top drawing here are the bones, mostly without any muscles, but he's going from the deepest to the surface, the deeper being the serratus muscles on the side and how they radiate from the lowest portion all the way up to the top of the rib cage, holding the scapula in place. Then the latissimus muscle through here, the serratus, what little of them we see along here, and the external oblique that comes down in these two different parts. We have the part that's up here on the rib cage, and then the lower part down along in here that's split between the rib cage and the pelvis. And he has more conversation here about the serratus muscles and how the serratus muscles draw the shoulder blade forward and raise the ribs, while the latissimus draws the arm back and inward, so towards our body, adducting it to the body. And then describes how the latissimus frames the back of the body here as it passes over the bottom of the scapula, and how the serratus muscles form the inner wall along in here between the pectoralis muscle and where they disappear into the latissimus muscle. And almost by repeating, he's talking here about the costal cartilage, how it frames the abdominal wall, how the abdominal wall has these three curves through here, and the side wall, which is fairly prominent. The external obliques that fill in this entire space through here and have a very strong line hanging over the pelvis. The serratus muscles that fill in this space, the pectoralis that comes down through here framing this and up along the edge of the shoulder at the deltoid break, and how the latissimus on the back is a strong shape through here. All of this again to say that if we remember these different plane breaks, we're going to give the torsos that we draw so much more structure to them when we draw them. And then finally on this last page, he's describing the action between the muscles, more so like the oblique muscles, and how part of them are responsible for lifting the rib cage while part of them are responsible for pulling the rib cage down. That in addition to the abdominal wall that's also responsible for pulling the rib cage down. This pushing and pulling between these muscles. Since a muscle really only functions in one direction, there's this play of opposition that helps keep our body upright, helps us lean back, and helps us tip forward. In this section, we look at the back of the torso, the back of the rib cage, the external obliques, the serratus muscles, the latissimus dorsi, and more. In all of these sections of the torso, Bridgman is talking about the separation of the parts. And in these separations of the parts, the wedging that goes on between the different groups. So on the back view, he's talking about the triangular design of the trapezius muscle and how strong it is. How strong the angular parts are of the deltoid breaking away from that. Then the wedging of the latissimus as it drops down through here, not to mention the independent muscles on either side of the spine and how strong they are. When the arm is raised, the strong angles that cut through here on both sides and the framing of the deltoid muscles and their strength, their visible strength of the triangular form when the arms are raised. And again, more of the different divisions through the trapezius muscle and the latissimus muscle. Our anatomy page, which shows the difference between the deltoid up above, the latissimus down below here, going up into the armpit, and the trapezius muscle along through here, which is much stronger looking through here when the arm is raised. And the three different sections of the trapezius, the part that comes from the tops of the scapula and clavicle, the midsection over the rhomboid, and then the triangular section between the scapulas as that goes down to the base of the rib cage. He describes the back as a series of lumps and bumps, not only because of the thinness of the muscles and being able to see the bones through it, but also the different layering of muscles on the back. Through here, we have the serratus muscles that are visible. Inside of here, we have the shoulder blade that's visible. The division of the deltoid, which is a little bit more angular through here, going up into the shoulder. The deltoid and its strength, the spine running down through the middle here. The latissimus muscles as they come down and turn into tendon before they meet the tailbone through this section. And again, the oblique and the strength of the oblique, the wall of the rib cage as it ascends up into the top of the body up here, the line along here of the oblique, and the line out here of the abdominal wall sitting in front. He also describes the little furrow down in here, the hollow that sits between both sides of the body as another major division. Over on this side, we also have the scapula, then the deltoid, the trapezius as it rolls up into the neck, and some of the strong lines that you might see of the trapezius depending upon the individual and how well developed their muscles are. Again, he's building upon the strength of the shapes. The base of the rib cage and where the latissimus muscles terminate from being strong muscles into strong tendons through the middle of the back. The erector spinae that passes up around through here, the depression at the base of the spine just above the tailbone, the scapulas here and over here separating from the body, the deltoid separation through here. When the arm is drawn back, we'll see these more clearly. The strong lines of the trapezius muscle up along through here and down along here, especially as it drops down to the base of the rib cage. The wedging of the tailbone in between the gluteus muscles on both sides. And then he refers back to his wooden puppet that he's built using the box forms and the different kinds of movement between the upper and the lower half. How much range of movement there is between those two shapes, with the thinness of the spine in between holding them in place. And then, of course, he has the head block attached to that, which also shows another form of movement. These three rigid parts of the body that are extremely flexible between here and between here. Most of the movement of the body comes from this space in here. When we twist and turn, each of the vertebrae contributes to that, but the majority of the movement is taking place within this area of the body here. And these last 2 pages are basically the range of motion within all of the examples that he has. Here he has a strong S curve showing each of these in opposition of each other. We have the body leaning over here to the side. So leaning in this particular direction. Here the rib cage is rotated this way while the pelvis is at an angle like this to it. So there's a twisting occurring through here. And then a few more examples. This one being upside down, the S-curve movement between the rib cage and the pelvis, the S-curve movement between the rib cage and the pelvis, and again the S-curve movement through here with a slight rotation above and less so below. And then the profile in motion with the upper torso leaning back much more than it usually does. And then that same view up here with the rib cage leaned back, you're going to get strong depressions all along the underside here from the muscles because of the extreme bend in the body. Here we look at the lower back between the rib cage and the pelvis and how the rib cage is held upright by the pelvis through the muscle structure. Moving down the figure, now we're in the lower back. This is between the pelvis and the rib cage, and these are the erector spinae muscles as well as the base of the latissimus muscles, and also a set of muscles that we don't see, that we don't need to draw, which are the serratus muscles on the back. These are much like the ones that attach the scapula to the rib cage, but these are holding up the back, and they're attached to the different ribs along the spine. This is the lever that holds our body upright. So the idea here is to see that this base down here is the attachment point for all the mass through here that holds the body upright like this. So this is like so because of these through here. And if you don't get the drawings right as far as copying them goes, that's not the point. The point is to actually understand that this is taking place, that we're designing the body like a machine, and that each of these different sections are different machine parts that help make this possible. The second drawing is something of the same thing, but it's more about the muscles that are sitting along the spine, right next to it, on both sides of it, as opposed to the much larger ones that are holding everything upright through here and along here. But again, the point of this is that the body is a machine and that we have these different parts of the body that make what we do possible. Then that's a lot of what he's breaking down in this book. By understanding the machine parts, you can accentuate the machine parts and make the body feel even more mechanical, even though that's not the right word for it, more constructed, more developed, very much like the Russian Academy does with all of their models, regardless of whether they're young, old, out of shape, really in shape, they all look like they work out every day, because the knowledge of the human form is a part of what makes their drawings so solid. By understanding the mechanics of everything, you know where to accentuate the body to make the body even more exciting to look at, more believable, and more developed as a drawing, as a piece of artwork, as a sculpture, whatever the art form is that you're doing. It's not just this set of tubes anymore. It's this series of complex shapes that interact with each other that help make each action that we pose more believable, more dynamic, and more interesting to look at. Now we look at the shoulder girdle and all of the muscles that hold the shoulder in place, as well as the muscles within the shoulder called the intrinsic muscles. This first page might be a little deceiving because there's a bar that goes straight across that connects both of the shoulders together. The reality is that bar has an anchor point at the very middle of the body, at the sternum, the manubrium specifically. In the construction class that I teach, we draw the point where it attaches as a big circle to remind us that this rotates, it rolls. The scapula and clavicle can go back behind us, they can go out in front of us, it can lift up above us, and we can draw it downward. Not too much, but we can still draw it downward. The point of this page is to show that it's what they call a shoulder girdle, this big shape that sits around the rib cage. So the rib cage is here, and this shape has the ability to move about without interfering in breathing, which is what he means here by without interfering in any way with the act of expiration or inspiration, breathing out or breathing in. The arms don't affect the breathing as far as making it more difficult for us to do that. And it's kind of like a bell shape. We have these two shoulders on either side that sit nicely against the bell shape of the rib cage and then slide around that central point without getting in the way of the core of the body. And then this page is a little more articulate, although again, we still have that bar that's going straight across. Here's that bar again, showing the shoulders in action with one another, but here is the actual design. Those 2 points are separated from one another, so our shoulders are actually free to move independently of one another, but as far as balance goes with the body, they will act in counterbalance to the pelvis much of the time to help create a stronger balance between the lower portion of the body and the upper portion of the body. Now, he's over designing these by showing the clavicles a little bit more visibly than they really are. I mean, the muscles come up and bury part of the clavicle here, cover up a part of the clavicle up here, and the acromion process, which isn't visible within these drawings. So it might actually look like the shoulder is made up of a point with the shoulder muscle surrounding it. But the point and the acromion process are both part of what makes our shoulder like this, a block surrounding a block. It's not a point in the middle with a circular form surrounding it. It's a block form. And then this, the deltoid, goes around that particular block. That's more specifically what our shoulders are designed like. And then he goes through and breaks down the different muscles of the shoulder. In this case, we have the deltoid. The deltoid attaches to the humerus bone, about halfway down the humerus bone. Here he has the clavicle, the acromion process, and the scapula. And then shows the deltoid connected to all of that by the humerus bone. And then he shows the connection between where the deltoid attaches to those three and then down the middle of the humerus bone. And then the conversation switches over to the pectoralis muscle, not shown on this page, but shown on the opposite page here. So the clavicular portion is the topmost portion of this connection. And then each of the other parts sit underneath, kind of like an accordion fan, and the way that those are built, where each segment of the fan is pinned to a point right here, but each of these segments can then all be folded up into one, and each of the points of each of these segments is extended beyond that point. When the arm is raised, all of those sections are parallel with one another. When the arm is lowered, this is the dominant sitting over the top of all the others. And then this is the mechanism of below and above, showing the overlap of the lowest point against the highest point on the arm, and showing the distance between those 2 points with all the other ones filling in the space in between. This is also showing the curl of the muscle separated from the bone, but this is how it wraps around the bone. It has that curl or the bend going around the bone, sitting over on the side of the bone as opposed to sitting in the front of the bone, stamped down against it. And by this design, it helps circumduct the arm, which means to rotate the arm in a 360-degree motion, and a little bit more in terms of from side to side, right? We can 360-degree parallel to the body, in front of the body, or behind the body. We have a lot of range of motion with the arm due to the design of this particular muscle. The numbers up here just refer to the different points of attachment, whether it's along the clavicle, the division between the deltoid and the pectoralis, the top of the sternum itself, fifth and sixth rib on the rib cage. Because the supraspinatus is not visible and doesn't physically show through the skin because the trapezius sits over the top of it, George Bridgman isn't involving that muscle as much as all the other muscles. So this 0 right here, which is a 0, not a hole, it represents the supraspinatus. Then we have the infraspinatus, the teres minor, and the teres major. Then he's showing the tendon of the tricep, which is number 4. Right? The tricep sits between both of these muscles, anchored to the scapula right around here. And then he's showing the deltoid, the spine along here, the acromion process as it goes up and over like this. And the deltoid is anchored to this corner of the scapula over here, but the muscle head begins right here. This is all tendon through here. And that tendon sits underneath the trapezius. And this wraps around to the side of the arm. And he's showing the same thing again here. All of the muscles in position with each other as the arm is forward in front of the body. This should be more cylindrical through here, as he's showing this being a cylinder here, with the top of the cylinder facing us. This diagram here shows the circular motion of the arm, and this is at its maximum position, so the scapula is facing this way, facing upward like so. This is more in regular position with the arm out to the side, showing the stretching here of the teres major. And then this is showing the arm pulled behind us and how all of the muscles are working in reference to that action with the arm behind the rib cage. Here the infraspinatus has been cut away, but visibly it would continue through here. I'm not really sure why he removed that, maybe to show the teres minor more specifically and how it attaches to the humerus bone. And I believe number 6 is the latissimus and how that goes forward here to the arm. So this is the latissimus through here, the tricep through here, teres major here and attaching to this point of the arm, teres minor, and the infraspinatus muscle, and how all of those attach to the humerus in reference to each other, the complexity of the shoulder and the armpit. Now in this diagram, what he's doing is he's showing the other muscles that are holding the scapula in place, the levator anguli up here, the rhomboid down here, the serratus over here, and how all of these muscles are in part responsible for this kind of motion as well as this motion over here of the arm. So the scapula and the arm. This is showing the muscle in action with the arm while these muscles are in action with the shoulder. This is a little bit radical here. While the arm goes forward, this does dip down, but I don't think it dips down this extreme of a degree, although I haven't watched every human being move their arms out in front of them. I just think that this might be drawn a little more extreme than what the action actually does. And then finally, George Bridgman has created the idea of the human machine, and he's stripped it down into machinated design here with the levers. The serratus muscles here, the rhomboid here, the levator anguli here, the clavicle, the acromion process, and the arm. The rotation of the shoulder, the rotation of the arm. The rotation point of the shoulder is through this midsection here. What he's saying about this point right here is the axis of the shoulder rotates here where the two bones meet one another, while this is the axis of the arm underneath that point. The whole scapula moves, from this central point here. Visibly, though, it looks like it's rotating from this point. The shoulder is quite a complex part of the body, and it does take a little bit more time to learn and understand all the functionality of it, more so than a lot of the other parts of the body. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just means we have a little more work to do to define it. And that, again, is where I rely upon 3D models to help visualize it. At least in this modern day, we have something like this. If you're in a classroom, you have a skeleton that you can actually work with to help you understand the definition of it. And then here again is the shoulder, pectoralis, intrinsic muscles, serratus muscles, showing how all of these different muscles hold the arm in place and help the rotation of it. The levator anguli, and then the muscles that I just took away, the latissimus and the trapezius. All of these muscles are based upon the development and movement of the shoulder. In this last section of the book that we cover in this particular episode, we look at the hips, the gluteus muscles, the tensor fascia lata, the design structure, and the planes. So what Bridgman means here by 2 innominate bones and 1 sacrum, the innominate mean without a name. These 2 sections on both sides are made up of 3 bones, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. So there's 3 sections to these larger bones, but the larger bones don't actually have a name to them. The tailbone, or the sacrum, sits in between both of those. The sacrum is the wedge that sits between them and holds them both together, and then the bones flare around that particular point. Come down, the ischiums are at the bottom, down along in here, and they form the pubis in the front and the little pipes in the back that are our sit bones. We'll look at all of this again in just a little bit when we look at the bones themselves, both the front view and the back view. But we have these 2, which are the innominate, and then the sacrum that sits in the middle, and that's what the tailbone of the spine, the base of the spine, and at the very end of that is the coccyx. Here we have the view of the front and the back. Here is the front and here is the back. The back, we have the posterior, superior, posterior, inferior iliac spine, the tailbone, the iliac crests on either side, and the ischium that look like they go to the middle, which they do, but that middle is in the front. And then here is the front. Here is the pubis that comes across, the iliac crests that go back, and the tailbone. I'm going to refer again to my 3D model here so we can see that in 3D space. So here is that front view, but if we look at it this way, we can see just how much space there is between the front and the back. And here is the back view, which the posterior inferior bumps aren't as visible here. They aren't as pronounced as they should be. And here is the posterior superior bumps. On the front, we have 2 bumps as well, right here and right here. Anterior superior iliac spine, anterior inferior iliac spine. This is what the rectus femoris is attached to. This bump right here is what the tensor fascia lata and the sartorius are attached to. So those bumps, those prominent bumps, are attachments for muscles on both sides of the body. So on this page, the muscles are covering up what we see here, which are these 2 wheel-like shapes that rotate, but they don't rotate. The whole wheel doesn't rotate. Only this bone rotates. This is the anchor for the bone, and then the bone itself has the great trochanter offset from the center of the pelvis, which is the rotation point. Here he has a third view, finally, so we can see how the front and the back relate to one another in terms of their design. And then he's broken this up into the back with the gluteus muscles to show the gluteus medius, the gluteus maximus, and the old word for tensor fascia lata, which is what the muscle is now called. So we don't need to use this at all. We can call this the TFL, tensor fascia lata. The rectus femoris is attached to this bump right here. Both of these are attached to this bump right here. Then the gluteus maximus sits underneath this one, and the gluteus medius fills in this entire space through here. And then this is in both of these views, the TFL and the sartorius framing the rectus femoris with this little hollow space that you don't actually really see because the skin covers it up. We have two of those on our back, one between the scapula and the spine, and the other where the obliques and the latissimus muscle overlap one another above the iliac crest. In this section of the hip, this is the back view and the profile view. He's basically saying that the muscles deform so much around this point that the only stable part of this whole section is the iliac crest, right along here. That's the stable point. On the back, we have the dimples of the sacrum. So we look for that to figure out the tilt of the pelvis. This will always be a fixture on every human being, regardless of their build. The oblique will cover up a portion of it, but that will also be a ridge that you see. The great trochanter forms a hollow if the leg is below the body without either hip being favored as far as the weight bearing in the body. And then it will stick out more if the body has tilt to it. It's going to push the bone outward, causing all of this section to deform. Where again, if the weight is normalized, then we're going to have an indentation for where the great trochanter is. But in both cases, again, the iliac crest is the stable part that we refer to define everything else that we see. The iliotibial band covers the great trochanter and also covers the gluteus medius, comes down and attaches to the tibia in the front, and sits over the middle of the vastus lateralis muscle. The gluteus muscles come down and then join together just below the sacrum, and then those attach to the iliotibial tract through here. The vastus lateralis comes out farther than the gluteus muscles, so there's an extrusion over here from all of these muscles over here. And the tensor fascia we don't see as easily. If you know what to look for, you'll find the raised bump, but a lot of the skin through here, especially when the leg is raised, is going to look like it blends together, but you still will find a little deformation here at the bottom of that muscle. And this also attaches to the iliotibial tract. And then from the profile view, here is where the spine attaches within the torso. Here is where the leg is pivoting from that central point. Gluteus medius, gluteus maximus, exposing the bone because this muscle should be partly covering that bone. And then the tensor fascia lata is strangely shaped in here but fills in this space. Then the rectus femoris is here, and the bicep femoris is here within this picture. This is the predominant marking that we're looking for, the iliac crest, because that tells us where the pelvis begins, so we could determine everything else here, especially if the model you're drawing from or the photo you're drawing from blends all of this together because the light has washed it out or the shadows are disguising all of that information. And if you were to enhance this information even slightly, it helps develop the hips, making them look more attractive in terms of the visualization of the body and how everything fits together when we draw it. Now, this part of the book is really minimal. It doesn't have as much information written on it as some of the other sections. The hand, in fact, is the largest section of the book. I'm not really sure why the hand had so much attention to it over everything else in the body, but this particular section is not as thorough as we would expect it to be. More modern anatomy books have a lot more information about these sections than Bridgman's book does, but Bridgman's book, again, goes over the construction and the mechanism of it, as well as the planar structure. If you can get through some of the drawings, you'll find that there's a lot of influential shape language here within this book if you're willing to study it. But as far as reading this section goes and trying to pair the words with the pictures, it is a very difficult section to get through, and I hope that I was able to get through this a little bit unscathed. I know it's difficult even for myself because sometimes, as much as I've studied this book over and over again, looking at the drawings, I'll scratch my head for a second and go, what am I looking at again? And that is part of the reason why this book can be a little deceptive as far as it being a really important book that we all must study, because there is a lot of confusion with it. I would say that this anatomy book is definitely for a more advanced artist who knows a bit about anatomy. There are better anatomy books now that I would recommend over this book first, as far as learning the information, where all the information is positioned. But I still highly recommend this book as far as the design of the body goes, because there's a lot of construction advice here that just goes unnoticed in so many of the modern books. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over a few examples of using a photograph and working with these particular parts of the body to study from and design from to help enhance the construction of the drawings based upon the models that I'm looking at.
If you like what you see in this video, go ahead and like, subscribe, and share this video with friends. I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much.
This is the first of two demonstrations working with the anterior or the front of the torso and utilizing the information that Bridgman has given us to help enhance the muscle structure as I draw the figure and as I lay out the figure and draw it to completion. Okay, so to start this drawing off, I'm going to use what I teach, which is the armature method. And I'm going to begin with the core. This is the only area I'm going to work on at this point, because this is the part of the body that this chapter covered, or these chapters covered. So the hips, the rib cage, the pelvis, and the shoulders. The center line is important. We can see an S curve in this. The upper half of the torso is facing this way. The lower half is facing in this direction, which means the center line needs to move over just a little bit more. The neck and the head are important to put in because they're scale. As well, the shoulders come up and support the head. Center line. The arm forward, foreshortened. The arm at his side. This is going back in space. Now the rib cage. And the shape of it, remember, it meets this center point. Also going to bring that in slightly. The pelvis, block-like, tilted forward so we can see the top portion of it. Tailbone, spine, the opening of the bottom of the rib cage, spine against sternum or spine across from sternum, the sternum shape, and the opening of the rib cage. Side plane. So this is the costal portion. And we mostly see that in the front view over here, with maybe a hint of the side. Then the clavicles. Made that wheel a little bit large. I'm going to bring that down in scale. Chromium process on both sides. And I'm going to increase the file size. But start it zoomed out so you have the big picture blocked in. Great trochanter. The great trochanter over here. So that means then that the hip is going to come out like this on this side, and it's going to depress on this side. once the muscles are blocked in. All right, I'm going to take that layer and lower the value so that it's ghosted. New layer. And I'll begin up here with the pectoralis muscles. The extension over into the arm. And this is following the deltoid rhythm as it goes up and over the bicep. And on this side, just going to work with the pectoralis muscle for the moment. The split in here, the perspective line, but with a slight curve underneath it to give it the volume that it needs. And then all of this and this are planes facing downward and to the side. The division between the deltoid and the pectoralis on both sides. Then I'll draw the deltoid going up and over and to its connection point over here. Lateral head, anterior, and then the same thing over on this side. Anterior head here, and a hint of the lateral head. Plane structure as it turns away from the light source. Plane structure through here, turned away from a light source just enough, but is still lit by the direct light source. Now, any small shape I make on one side, I carry over with a rhythm to the other side. All right, now moving down through the figure. I want to build the abdominal wall. Its angle comes down like this for the muscle heads, but the fascia is like this on both sides. The external obliques, over here and over here, following what's called the inguinal ligament, as that comes down to the pubis. The frame of the abdominal wall. The extrusion of the abs, where the initial center line is movement, this is now volume. The navel as a landmark. The split in the lower abs. They're line designed. Then the middle ab through here and over here. And then the upper abs through here and here. Now I could block these in with halftones as well. But I just need to be mindful of not overdoing it because I do need the shadows to clearly read as shadows. And I'm going to keep everything hatched in, kind of like how Bridgman would use hatch lines as well. The latissimus muscle is over here. I'm going to aim that down and over here away. You can see a change in the direction just at the very base. And then up along in here where it meets the other muscles of the shoulder. The serratus muscles, as they radiate through the body like this. Then the shapes of the serratus muscles, making sure that each one grows narrower or smaller as it gets covered up by the latissimus muscle. Then the striations for the obliques, which we're also going to see on this side. These are the striations for the obliques. Now as we get down to the lower abs, we have the part of the oblique that sits between the rib cage and the pelvis through here. And on the other side, the oblique is flexing through here. The epigastral obliques through here. And then how the obliques insert onto the fascia, especially with him, is very defined. This, I'm losing some of the angle of the pose, so I'm going to pull this line back slightly. The bicep through here with its tendon or tendons, coracobrachialis, and then the tricep head. Over on the other side, do the same thing. Going to drop this down just a little bit lower. Bicep head is through here. Tendon of the bicep. Brachialis, tricep head. Also sending that out a little too far, but I also need to make this area a little bit wider. And then up on the top here, following this rhythm, up into the back of the neck. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Follow this up into the back of the neck. Then out of the acromion process. Out of the acromion process. Sternocleidomastoid muscles here and here, with their tendinous connection to the clavicle. Redefine the clavicle and acromion. The split between the pec and the deltoid. Curve these to give them volume. Halftone edge. Minor halftone edges here and here. This side we can see the influence of the rib cage through the ab, but I'm going to leave that alone for now. The extreme shadow on the oblique, and then the halftones as it transitions around to the front. Going to do the same thing here, halftones to the transition. Extreme shadow along here. This is the back of the lat. And then into the armpit. Up and over the bicep. Redefining the contours on both sides. And as you can see now, I have a lot to blend out if I'm going to paint this. But as far as a drawing goes, I've built the structure utilizing a lot of the defining rhythms that Bridgman indicated in his chapter, especially with regards to the obliques. And that's using the Bridgman information, but not getting lost in Bridgman's drawing process. I use the hatch lines in his process to define the forms without getting caught up in rendering and really trying to see the 3 dimensions. But again, I didn't get lost in trying to copy Bridgman one-to-one, but using his methodology for seeing. And then the rest of these halftones to turn the form. So that's a front view, or the anterior view. Now I'll do a posterior view. In this last section and this last demonstration, I draw the anterior side of the figure and utilize Bridgman's information to help complete the picture. I'll begin again with the pillow shape. Tilt of the shoulders. Tilt of the hips. The angle of the body is in this direction. I'll start with the front. Go to the back. The hips are turned away more than the rib cage, so I want to make sure that the lower half of this pillow shape is narrower and the upper half is wider. Shoulder to hips, something like this. I want to make sure I see the same thing here in my drawing. Center line starts more centered here, narrower over here, S curve through, ribcage shape. The opening of the neck. The neck as it's leaned forward. Skull shape. In profile. Side plane of the skull. The arm as it goes forward slightly. So the ellipse is reminding me of that. The arm as it goes behind the body, but also away from the body. With slight flexion in both of the designs. Angle this just a little bit more. Pelvis at its tilt. Tailbone. Bottom of the pelvis. Spine. Up into the back of the skull, behind the jaw. Scapula 1, scapula 2, the volume of the scapula. This one's rotating around the side just a little bit. And so is this one. Actually, this one's drawn back. This one's sliding forward slightly. The acromion process, clavicle, acromion process, and we don't see the clavicle in this view. Lighten the layer. new layer, starting now with the ribcage rhythm through here, and a hint of it over here. Trapezius as it goes up into the back of the neck. Down to the C7, which we don't see very well because, of course, the hair is covering that. Clavicular bump, deltoid shape, as it comes down to meet the humerus, which I did forget to draw in. Armpit over here. Armpit over here. Tricep rhythm, as that meets the ulna bone. The split between the two heads of the tricep is visible on this arm, not so much on this one. Down to the elbow. Back around, inserting into the deltoid. The deltoid rhythm, we don't see as much of it because of how much the arm is rotated away from our view. Tricep heads. Latissimus, as that comes down and meets the rib cage. Swinging up and over the shoulder blades. We see the heads over here. We aren't going to see them as easily over here because they're closer to us and his body's rotated enough where we really only see, because the back is shaped like this, we're looking here over here. We're looking here over here, but not seeing much of this over here. The line down the middle where the spine is. The striations are really prominent on this side, but I don't want to get caught up in them too soon. I want to make sure that everything else gets blocked in as well. Trapezius. This side isn't as easy to see because it's being washed out by the light source. This side is much easier to see. The tendinous connection on the scapula. The line above the scapula. Along the edge of the scapula, down into the serratus. Over here we can definitely see the serratus separation through here, but we also see the lift of the scapula right along here. The teres major, right along in here, is very prominent. Deltoid is very strong through here. So this is the posterior view, then the lateral, or the posterior head, then the lateral head. Over on this side, we only see the posterior head. But we also see that teres major has a strong shape through here. Then the erector spinae muscles, as they build out these columns through here and through here. The external oblique, squishing through here, flexing in other words, as that comes up and meets the rib cage, abdominal wall, pectoralis muscle up here, tensor fascia lata, greater trochanter, gluteus minor or medius, gluteus maximus, then over on the other side, gluteus maximus, and a hint of the oblique, just not as strong on that side. Strong tendons of the latissimus muscle, halftones and shadow patterns, through here, along here, through here, up here, strengthen these silhouette lines, and that is what we get in the design of the back. I'm just going to put in a few more indicators here to help strengthen some of the cuts that we see visibly. Halftones through here. Shadow pattern deviating here. Halftone pattern through here. There's a subtle halftone along here. And then, of course, the change in value along the spine through here. Halftone and shadow patterns on the gluteus muscles across the head of the great trochanter up into the gluteus medius, shading the tensor fascia muscle as that becomes rectus femoris and the hamstring group. Bicep, forearm, forearm through here, and we see the hand changing direction, so we do see the wrist in there. The epicondyles of the humerus, the ulna bone, and the curvature of the flexors. And there you have it. Two different armatures with the posterior and the anterior views. Utilizing Bridgman's information to help us define things more than just draw big, open, simple shapes. And I hope this has helped you piece together some of what you would want to do yourself when you're learning to use the information you're working with from Bridgman's book. Drawing his images is one thing, but applying his information to your own imagery is, I think, a little bit more important, which is what I hope you saw here.
Well, I hope you found this information useful for your own studies. I know that this particular part of the book is a little bit confusing, as little as there is about this information. In the next episode, we're going to go over the arms and the legs. And then in the final episode, the hands. Over half of the book is dedicated to the hands, so we need an entire video just on that subject. All right, everyone. Good luck with your studies. Stay creative, and I'll see you soon. Take care.